you for joining you a little bit late. For some reason, I wasn't able to connect, but I'm glad I'm with you now. Just a welcome to those who are joining us from abroad. I do realize that there are some people from outside of South Africa. Special welcome to all of you, and of course to all the people from South Africa, from the different universities, institutions, and churches who are joining us in this conversation today. This is a very important conversation with regards to economy and environment, and we know that these are discussions that we need to continue to have because the struggles of all of these continues to live with us, not just only in South Africa, but across the globe. I would like to just remind you, if you don't already know about it, but in 2004, the World Alliance of Reformed Churches then, which subsequently became the World Communion of Reformed Churches in 2010, adopted the Accra Confession. And the Accra Confession is an important document that spoke, in my opinion, as a rejection in terms of empire, but spoke more specifically about three important issues in terms of injustices and the things that we need to be doing in order to work for and towards justice. The Accra Confession spoke about what it can accept, but also spoke about what it rejects. And so the three things that it spoke about more particularly in that confession was economic justice, gender justice, and ecological justice. Now, if there's anything that COVID-19 has done for us, it has certainly exposed the scandalous nature of all of these things that we're talking about. Because COVID-19 has made us to suddenly realize the depth of inequalities, of poverty, and of unemployment that we experience not only in South Africa, but across the globe. COVID-19 has exposed us to the harmful effects of economic policies that continues to make the rich richer and the poor poorer. In South Africa right now, the COVID-19 has shown us that more than 3 million people are already unemployed. And one wonders what is going to happen to them in the future, because the economic crisis is incredible in terms of so many people who are starving, have no access to money or to provisions. And some of these provisions that have been made possible for people do not necessarily end up in the places where it should. And in South Africa right now, just listening to our president speak yesterday, corruption has been a real serious concern for us. And you could see how the poor continues to suffer in this entire thing. We've had hundreds and thousands of small businesses that are already starting to close down, and the prediction is that much more will close. And so the people who have actually been trying to make a living and to sustain themselves economically are now at the end of the road where they actually cannot function anymore. I have for myself seen visibly how many shops in the area where I live have actually shut down because they cannot sustain themselves during this COVID-19 time, and especially during this peak that we are experiencing in our country at the moment. So COVID-19 has shown us the inequalities, the rising trend of unemployment, and also the deeper trends and trenches of poverty. We keep talking about, I heard the UN Secretary General the other day in his Nelson Mandela presentation say that COVID-19 has given us the opportunity to turn the economy around. And our own president in South Africa repeatedly says that the COVID-19 experience enables us now to actually shift and change and, in a sense, upset the economy from its existing capitalistic tendencies. That's all well and good, but when you look at it, the poor are suffering a lot more. And my concern has been, everybody talks about a turning around and the opportunity to change the economy. The question for me is, where is the strategic plan? If our government plans to do that and to change use this as an opportunity to actually turn the economy around, where is the plan? What are they doing? So we're simply talking the language, but we're not actually engaging the action. And I'm not seeing a strategic plan that speaks to that particular end. What we continue to see is what I call cowboy economics. And this cowboy economics that continues to make the rich richer and the poor poorer. poorer. The people who are suffering most, not those who actually have money, because they have money. So even in lockdown, they can continue to sustain themselves. But there are people who are going to bed without food, real hungry stomachs. We have heard stories about people drinking water on a nightly basis and just to put the children to sleep with something in the stomach. Some of us do not feel these things because we are better off than others. But the poor are taking a bad turn and a worse experience during this COVID-19 scenario and pandemic. And so what are we doing to actually turn things around is a crucial question that we need to ask. Yesterday, for example, the government closed down schools again, public schools. I mean, I do not want to get into the debate of whether schools should remain open or be closed. But one of the sad things is that private schools can continue. So it shows that even in our country and even in the economy, those who have money have privilege and opportunity. So it is okay for a child who is coming, or for a parent who is more wealthier than others, to be able to sustain the education of the children. But the majority of people who are poor, their education doesn't count. They can lose the academic year. These inequalities speaks volumes. It shows us how we actually continue to manipulate economies, that those who have can continue to actually sustain privileges. And whilst I think, issues of livelihood and safety and all of those things are important, but for a moment we do not think and act in the way that we ought to in order to actually deal with these discrepancies and these inequalities that we consistently talk about and say that we want to address. But here's an example of our failures to do so. And so, biblically speaking, we know that God favors the poor. God is on the side of the poor. God chooses for the poor. The preferential option of the poor is something that we have learned through liberation theology, black theology of liberation, and other contemporary theologies. But we need to talk about how these things impress on understanding economic issues. The second issue is for the gender justice. I'm not going to say too much about that because we've had a previous webinar about that. But again, COVID-19 has shown us the gender injustices, inequalities, the way women and children are treated, speaks to us daily about what is happening as we see the violence that is taking place against women. And then the third thing in the Act of Confession was the ecological justice. Well, it's been interesting to see that some of the reports that have come back to us is that the environment, creation is starting to breathe again because of COVID-19. With the reduction or the total stopping of flights, we have our carbon footprint has actually become a lot better in terms of the environment and the purity of the environment, if I may use that terminology. But now the creation is breathing again. But what's going to happen after COVID-19? Will we go back to all of those kind of experiences where we plunder the earth and the economy and the environment suffers? These are all critical questions, and I'm hoping some of the COVID-19 will help us to learn some of these things that we for long have been talking about, but we're forced into a new experience. But now the question is, how are we going to take this experience of COVID-19 to turn the world around, to turn the economy, to turn gender injustices, and to turn ecological injustices so that everybody in creation and in the world at large can have abundance of life and breathe. So let's have those conversations today, and I hope it will be fruitful. So welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for this opportunity to share a little bit, but my task is to welcome you, and I welcome you all joyfully. Thank you, Dr. Dube.
Thank you, Dean, and thank you for the wonderful remarks and introducing us to the issues that you're going to grapple with today. I'm going to just go through some of the basic housekeeping. I want to reiterate the earlier remark that if we can, except for the two speakers that we have, that is Tamarius and Lorenzo, we can switch off our videos so that the network is not overloaded and we don't have a jam. We're going to have 20 minutes each for each speaker. followed by 15 minutes discussion. If you have a question or the area that you might need to have further discussion on, there is a chat section on your right hand side. Just put on the question there, and then we might follow up with the question, or you might ask the question, or I might ask the question on your behalf. Without further ado, let me quickly introduce our first speaker, who is in this sense Professor Lorenzo. So Professor Lorenzo is going to speak on COVID-19. Now is the time for a well-being economy. Professor Lorenzo is actually one of us here at University of Pretoria. He's a professor of political economy at the University of Pretoria. And Lorenzo was the founding director of the Center for the Study of Governance and Innovation here at UP, and now a research fellow of this center. He is also extraordinary professor at the School for Public Leadership at Stellenbosch, a senior fellow at the Center of Social Investment at the University of Edinburgh, an associate fellow of the United Nations University, and the list goes on. In 2019, he became Minister of Education, University and Research of his native country, Italy, and has made education on climate change and sustainable development compulsory in all schools in Italy. One of his books was entitled Well-Being Economy, Success in a World Without Growth. We ask him today to speak to us about this topic. Now is the time for a well-being economy. Professor Lorenzo, I welcome you to speak to us. I give you the opportunity and the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. I'd like to extend my thanks to the organizers and to the Faculty of Theology, my friend and colleague, Stefan De Veer. I very much appreciated this opportunity to have this conversation at, while we are in the middle of this incredibly transformative and at the same time extremely sad crisis. And I'd like to echo what Professor Pillay said in the opening of this webinar. There's a lot of talk about the possibilities that we may have to turn this crisis into an opportunity. But let me say, this is not going to happen on its by itself, by default. A crisis must be turned into opportunities by intellectuals, by politicians, by activists, by everyone, by citizens, by starting to build the future that we'd like to see every day. The first remark, I'm going to speak very briefly because I want to leave as much space as possible for debate. And then, as the organizers know, I have another important webinar at 1 o'clock, so I need to move on to the next one. But I think that COVID-19 really brought into sharp relief the inconsistencies of conventional economic thinking. Now, I've been doing this job for as long as I can remember. At least for the past 10 years, I've written books, papers, given talks, interviews to highlight the inconsistencies of, the current mainstream economic approach to economic growth, to expansion, to wealth creation, and to value creation, and so on and so forth. Why has COVID-19 brought these inconsistencies into such a sharp relief? Because it has reconnected our economic trajectories to what is really the foundation of human well-being, which is our health, our social connections, and the ecosystems. We have forgotten that we can only operate, we can have markets, we can have enterprises, we can enjoy consumption only because there are people that need to be in good health and because the ecosystems allow us to do so. In doing so, in basically pursuing this consumerist trajectory towards continuous accumulation of material things, we have forgotten that we were weakening our social connections by increasing inequalities to an extent which is almost unprecedented in the modern age. By all standards, our societies, South Africa above all, are more unequal than ever over the past at least 150 years, let's say the modern contemporary age. Okay, and our footprint, destructive footprint on the environment, is without any, unparalleled in history. And COVID-19 has brought this into sharp relief because, first of all, COVID, where does SARS-CoV-2, the virus, come from? It comes from humans having destroyed and abused and introduced themselves into pristine ecosystems that previously were not inhabited, where pathogens had been operating for millions of years without having had contact with humans. And what happens? There's a beautiful book that you probably have read called Spillover. What happens when you do so? You're operating in a very complex natural system as if you were a bull in a china shop. You move around, shake things, you destroy ecosystems, cut trees, build new things, mix up the different functions of these ecosystems, and then something happens. And something happens, and a virus makes the jump, goes from the animal realm onto the human realm. And look, if you see any serious work on SARS, MERS, the previous coronavirus-based pandemics that we have had, you will see that virologists had already identified the high risk that at some point, probably even sooner than we expected, we would have had an airborne disease going around the world and disseminating destruction. And this happened, and we were not prepared because, of course, we had created a global governance system, a globalization system that made everything possible in terms of flying all over the world and consuming things produced in China and then disposed in South Africa and so on and so forth, without ever thinking that at some point, complex systems must be managed also when it comes to problems. And on the other hand, so it comes from the natural environment, from our abusive relationship with natural environment. And on the other hand, it has generated it has exacerbated inequalities so much. And Professor Pillay was mentioning this. Those that can isolate themselves are doing relatively well so far. And those that can't are suffering, are bearing the brunt of this. And our governments are, the more unequal our societies are, the fewer instruments governments had at their disposal to deal with the crisis. And that's why in South Africa, notwithstanding the relatively low number of casualties, you have fewer tools, fewer strategies to put in place than countries that are less unequal. Because, isolation is complex, because closing down schools becomes a social problem, because many kids only get proper food when they go to school, for instance. And so many parents cannot look after their kids doing home office and so on and so forth, maybe like they do somewhere else in other countries that are less unequal and have more social provisions and better working welfare systems. So somehow we now have realized, or we should have realized, that our system of economic production and wealth creation was very ephemeral because it had very weak foundations. And the weak foundations have got to do, as I said, with health and social connections and the environment. Without these two pillars, everything crumbles. And this is why years ago, I just want to show you this, for those of you that don't know this book, I wrote this book called Well-Being Economy, Success in a World Without Growth, dedicated to South Africa, to show exactly what I'm trying to say. That is that without focusing on the foundations, the shopping mall economy is fragile, doesn't go anywhere. It collapses overnight. And countries, rather than promoting big infrastructure, new consumers opportunities, new malls, new major megalopolies, and so on and so forth, should focus on what really matters. That is protecting personal health, making sure that people have good social capital, that is that they are connected with each other, that people are trustworthy and that can trust one another, that communities are healthy, and that the environment is resilient and our approach with the environment is in balance, which is exactly the opposite. Take me at face value, and then we can discuss this during the Q&A, which is exactly the opposite of what we have done. In the pursuit of this model of economic growth, we've done exactly the same. We've said, oh, healthcare doesn't really matter. If we have money, we need to put it into what is productive, and healthcare is not productive. Education, according to this view, is not really productive. So it's being, it's been structurally defunded. And the same applied to the environment. Every time someone raised a hand to say, hey, but if we endanger our air, our quality of life will be impacted. People will go like, oh my God, here is another environmentalist. Come on, we need a serious economy. And a serious economy means mining, oil, new heavy infrastructure, roads to move goods around and all of that. That has created all the weaknesses that we're now facing. And that's why I hope that politicians are now serious about this. And I have to say, having lived in South Africa for 20 years, unfortunately, I've heard this story of the economic transformation, turning the economy around so many times. Every government that came to power would say, it's now the time to turn the economy around. It's now the time to do something totally different, and never did it. I hope that now they find the courage to call into question the pillars of their economic thinking. The fact that there is no economic prosperity without the health of people and the health of ecosystems. That these should be the first and most important preoccupations of our treasury, of our president, of our entrepreneurs. Not only creating jobs, but creating jobs that are enhancing the quality of life. Creating a model of production which is distributed rather than concentrated. In South Africa, we have so many shopping malls. We have a concentration of wealth in some few areas, and then the rest is completely secluded, rather than having a distributed economy where you have a growth of small and medium and micro enterprises. Exactly the opposite of what we have seen over the past few years, in which concentration of wealth and purchasing power has been a priority by all infrastructure that has been built in South Africa, and so on and so forth, and putting the environment at the center of economic policy making. We need to say we have seen the water crisis. Droughts have destroyed our agriculture and food production systems. Now we're going to have continuous climate change based effects on our economies, coupled with COVID and the lockdowns. This is the perfect recipe for disaster. So unless we really change and take a U-turn, and also stop listening to the usual economists, because the usual economists, I'm sorry, have been part of the problem. And it's time that we listen to those that years ago had already identified some of these problems, although they were maybe criticized, attacked, and even ridiculed. Unless we do so, we may miss this opportunity. So, as I said, that's why I gave it this title. A well-being economy, the time for a well-being economy is now. It's now or never. We don't have so much time to turn things around, and we need to call into question the fundamentals of our economic thinking. What do we mean by growth? If growth means destruction of the environment, endangering our health, and creating a system of consumption which is self-destructive, that's not the growth I want. I want growth which is about well-being, growth which is about increasing the quality of life, growth which means investing in schools because education is the most productive investment you can make. Growth that means investing in public health care, because without that one, you cannot have a market or a functioning economy. And now we know that without public health care, functioning public health care, there's nothing else. Everything else crumbles. So even in our own self-interest, if we are self-interested, we need to put the well-being of people and the well-being of the environment at the core of our economic policy. Otherwise, we're simply building a giant with the feet of clay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lorenzo, for that stimulating discussion. You raised very powerful points there that we might need to nibble together. I'm going to start with a question to you, Lorenzo, perhaps as others are preparing also their questions. Lorenzo, what are our agencies here? What is our starting point if we pick up from your last statement? What is the constituents of this campaign? What can churches do? What can communities do? Is this talk? Should we submit this talk to the politicians? And we know that they are not going to do it. But from a micro perspective, what can we do? If you can offer a prescription or some examples or practical steps that we can start to do from a local church community and other areas.
Thank you, Zoro. Look, I need to premise the fact that I want to be clear. No solution will be painless. Okay. And unfortunately, we wasted so many years, and this is true in South Africa as it is all over the world. Had we done this 5 or 10 years ago, it would have been totally different. I'm so sorry that no one listened. No one listens. You know, there's this blindness, inability to see the iceberg coming. It happened to the Titanic, and it keeps happening all the time. We seem to be totally unable to preempt, you know, like the disasters. Maybe this is the way humans are. Maybe humans need to almost destroy themselves before they change. At the end of the day, we seem to be less capable than animals. You know, like rats and cockroaches can feel the earthquake early on, and they leave the city, and the humans stay there until all the buildings crumble. So that should also, I think, in a sense, I think this is also important for the churches. Remind humans that they're not superpowers. Superheroes. We have built a narrative according to which we can do whatever we want, that we're always the top of the food chain. Believe me, we are not. I'm not a biologist. I'm not a zoologist, but I can tell you the information I've found over so many years working at universities is that humans believe they're at the top of the food chain, but they're not more intelligent than many other animals. In many cases, they're less intelligent. They're less able to preempt damage. I think this is important because it humbles us, and I think churches are well positioned to remind humans that you're not separated from nature. You're part of it, and when you destroy it, when you abuse it, you're abusing yourself. Having said this, what can we do immediately? I think if I were in South Africa right now and some politician was listening, which is not the case, of course, I would say it is now the time to launch a serious investment program funded with, new taxation, for sure. You know, if you cannot, funded with public debt, I believe that South Africa should try and get and raise as much money as possible on markets through public debt. But also, it is fundamental that we explain to everyone that unless we raise tax on wealth now, the rich will be worse off in South Africa too. So that it's in the interest of rich people to limit the inequalities, otherwise the country will go belly up and they will lose everything they have. Of course, to do so, you need a political class which is credible. And I'm not sure South Africa at present has it 100%. I hope that, I understand and I presume that the president has the right charisma and the right credibility, but people around him may not have the same sort of pedigree. However, this is the time to say we're all in this together. Government will need to lead by example, and we need to raise tax, because unless we help people go by, unless we give people money to survive, and this is happening all over the world. I mean, I'm sitting in Italy now, and in Italy, the government has decided to give people money, and now the European Union is investing billions and billions of euros to make sure that people can go through this transition and build a new European economic system. But during the transition, they need to be supported. You cannot expect people to transition without having any support. So I think in South Africa, that's equally important. I mean, to fund it with public debt, and also with new tax. And I think that if you frame it correctly, and the many wealthy people of South Africa realize how important this is, they will be willing to say, here it is, taxes more, that's fine. But I want to make sure that what is done is not going to be fueling corruption, but actually supporting this transition, helping people make ends meet, and help us generate new enterprises and new jobs for the economy of tomorrow, not to revive the economy of the past. And here I mean Eskom, for instance. How many millions have we lost in Eskom, trying to support Eskom, when it would have been so much easier to try and decentralize energy production rather than having coal plants, having solar panels and wind turbines on every school, on every hospital, on every roof of any house, and be able to decentralize the production of energy that would have been empowering at the local level and also cheaper for the country itself. So,
okay. Lorenzo, I'm going to limit you so that we take a number of questions from, I think there are many. I've seen that Annalette has also posted a question there. She wants to know if all of us, perhaps, if we have questions, just to post them, or we might indicate to Lorenzo, because he's gonna leave us in 20 minutes time. So Annalette needs to know, how do we take this opportunity to turn around the way in which we produce food, so as to alleviate hunger and to put back the basic production of economic and livelihood means in the hands of the marginalized majority of this country. Lorenzo?
I think it's inevitable that we move from commercial farming gradually, but now we need to accelerate because we've lost so much time, from commercial farming to agroecology. Agroecology means that we do produce effectively, but at the local level, and food production is as decentralized as possible. You know that since the end of apartheid, the number of big farmers in South Africa hasn't significantly changed. That means that we're still dependent on a few producers. That is okay from an economies of scale perspective, but it's very disempowering and potentially debilitating from a perspective of social justice and food access and distribution. That's why we need to support that. That means training people as more effectively, having lost at least 2 decades, and making people understand that producing food locally, then having an approach which is called agroecology, which means basically doing it with biological systems and using local knowledge as well as scientific technology, new technologies that can help that. And we see that happening across Africa, for instance, where some countries are ahead of South Africa in terms of food production according to the systems, is the only way forward. Smallholders are the future, and technology can help them become effective and extremely productive as well.
Thanks, Lorenzo, for that. I'm gonna read again the question from Dion, is my colleague from Stellenbosch. Dion is asking, one of the critiques that is often raised is that those of us who are privileged, already comfortable and wealthy, now wants to call for others who do not share in these resources to make difficult choices to limit their economic development and growth, while we change nothing for ourselves. How do we manage this tension? Lorenzo?
This is a very, very apt question. And it's first of all, that's why in my books and in my work, I always say the countries and the people that should lead by example are those that have already grown, have already exploited the planet and other people and other countries before. So it makes no sense that someone sitting in Washington or someone sitting in Berlin or Paris tells someone sitting in Costa Rica or Kenya or Nigeria, you need to stop growing. So first of all, it is a fundamental imperative for those societies that have already taken enough of the cake, the limited cake that we'll have to share in. At the same time, however, I want to tell my friends and my sisters and brothers from Africa, what's the point of simply replicating the broken models of other countries? Can't we do better than them? It's a bit like, I think anyone would like to develop better than the previous generation. If we were to simply follow, if we were to say, oh, you did it this way, we want to do it this way as well, we would still be cavemen. If we didn't learn on other generations' mistakes, every life would be starting from the beginning and trying to do and make all the mistakes that previous generations have already made. So I think Africans have to be ambitious and say, we want to leapfrog. We don't want to make the same mistakes of Europeans. How do they feed themselves? Well, by exploiting the whole planet, colonizing half globe, and having 2 world wars. So is that your development trajectory? Is that what you want? Do you think that African countries should develop by colonizing the rest of the world, killing millions of people during 2 world wars, so that then they can get to where America or where France is now? I think there's a better way. And I think they can teach the rest of the world how to do it better. So this is why I'm saying, when I look at growth, at the old-fashioned paradigm of growth, I think Africans may be more ambitious to say, we don't want to be stupid like you guys. We want to grow in a different way. We want to grow by not destroying ourselves. We want to grow in a way which is more intelligent than what you guys have done over the past few decades.
Okay. I'm going to read to you, Lorenzo, the questions from Glynis. She's my pastor. my spiritual pastor. So I'm happy that Glenis, you are with us today. And I'm also gonna read the question by Joel. Then I'm gonna leave that one by Stefan. Then we can pick it up if we have another one which is coming down. But Glenis wants to know, would the reintroduction of common land for small allotments available to people without access to personal property be a means of addressing issues like food security? So I think she's talking about the question of distribution of land and the production here. Then Joel wants to know, do we know how much wealth sits in the coffers of the church in South Africa, especially prior and current dispensation? Any research work done, including assets and the hard cash? Joel, you are touching on the nerve of the bishops here. Lorenzo, you can answer those questions.
Okay, so I'm going to leave the one about the churches to the church people that are here, to the experts from the church community. I'm not an expert on that, and I don't know. But I think there's an underlying element there. So much wealth has been accumulated over the past centuries, but certainly decades, that needs to be put to service. We cannot simply think that that wealth is destined to private property and to private consumption forever. You know, like even the concept of private, I'm in favor of private property, okay? I don't want to sound like a Marxist, but I think the fundamentals of private property is that is put to use for collective well-being. When that doesn't happen, then the interest of the owner himself or herself to change the approach to private property. And some constitutions, like the Italian constitution, this is written in the constitution. You cannot simply accumulate and let the thing sit idle without doing anything with it that is of advantage to society at large. Having said this, the question to Glenis, she was asking about land redistribution. I think I'm a firm believer in the governance of the commons. Okay, there is a whole strand of research in economics about how communities can come together with governance systems that are effective and built on reciprocity, but also on clear access rules and so on and so forth to manage common resources. And I think in South Africa, like in Italy, where it's been done in the past, certain things should be managed as if they were commons. Water, some parts of land, and food production in some areas. It's much better and much more productive than doing so by simply privatizing and or nationalizing. What scares me is this dualism between privatization and nationalization. I think we need to get out of this dualism because both of them are extremely ineffective and tend to concentrate either in the hands of a private landlord or in the hands of an often dysfunctional state apparatus. What you want is create a governance system, a sharing mechanism whereby different players can all use the same resource and get the best out of it. For instance, sharecroppers in Italy over the past few at least since the 11th and 12th hundred, were extremely effective at generating food, local economies, incredible levels of exchange by working on land that they didn't even know. It wasn't their land, but they were using it. And there were agreements and sharing procedures so that different farmers could use the same land mechanisms, okay? It's a system called sharecroppers. Now, this is extremely important, and some of these mechanisms can be introduced in South Africa as well. Some of them already exist in some of the previous homelands where the chiefs often rule and administer land according to similar procedures, okay? Some of them are more effective than others. But I think that is fundamental. However, my perception is that the land redistribution narrative in South Africa is very poorly framed, and it's often perceived as if the state wanted to take away land from private hands just to give it away, Zimbabwe style. And that wouldn't be effective. What we need is a mechanism whereby the land is not owned by anyone, but those that use it in so far as they can generate profits for themselves and for the communities. And that gives you the right access to land according to mechanisms rather than ownership per se. So I would focus on that. It's rather than ownership is correct use of land that should be at the base of our policy.
Thank you, Lawrence. I'm gonna read the questions. Perhaps you can answer them briefly. Because you need also 10 minutes to prepare for your next meeting as well. I'm going to read the remark by Stefan. He's saying, in the absence of bold and brave political decision, for example, taxing wealth more deliberately, how can local communities foster well-being economies? Or are we entirely dependent on the government? This is a very good question, Stefan. Then Wayne is asking a question here relating to memory and the Spanish flu. He says, the Spanish flu fell from our collective memory worldwide for some reason. No monuments to the lost people, not much scholarship around it. And now the new pandemic. We work in a panic act mode cycle very quickly. Well, we forget the death, the frontline workers, such as the grocery workers, as keeping the country, who are keeping the country going. How would you suggest that we keep this, that we now experience with us, to ensure we actualize the well-being of the economy? I think he's asking the question of memory and how we can use the past experiences to tackle the present. If you can briefly answer those questions, Lorenzo, before you leave us, those two questions. Over to you.
Sure. I'll start from the last one. I think you guys are perfectly right. We suffer from short memory loss. Absolutely. Humans, as I said, humans are not only less developed and less intelligent than many other animals, they also don't seem to have the same ability to remember. I mean, we all know that elephants, lions, most animals remember smell, remember people years and years later for maybe having seen them only once. And I think we should learn from animals, because we tend to forget all the time. That's why we reward and praise politicians that have no credibility, right? You know, you would wonder, you know, like, how can Americans elect Donald Trump? I mean, like, how can you be so unable to remember, to have a sense of what happened in the past, to let someone become a president, notwithstanding his past? Or the same can be said about presumably Jacob Zuma or many other leaders. People tend to forget, and this is a major problem, and we cannot forget. This time we shouldn't forget. So I'm totally in favor. In Italy, we have declared a National Memory Day for the victims of COVID-19, for instance, and I think we need to remember. And because the reference is extremely, to the Spanish flu is extremely apt. The Spanish flu was destructive. It killed 50 million people, okay, in 1918, 1919, and so on and so forth. 50 million people. But after the Spanish flu, the world didn't become better. It became worse. There was the rise of fascism in Europe, and we ushered into major economic crisis, the 1929 Wall Street collapse, Nazism, fascism, and the Second World War. So if that is anything to go by, the future is not going to look pretty bright this time. We need to make sure that this crisis is remembered, and not the consequences of the crisis, but the reasons, the root causes of the crisis. The consequences may be more poverty, more inequality, but we should never forget why we got this crisis in the first place. And the reason why we got the crisis was an economy that was out of balance with reality and simply abused social dimensions, social well-being, and environmental well-being to pursue a model of economic growth that was becoming destructive. And when the virus struck, we were totally ill-prepared, and our economies themselves started collapsing. And I come to the first question by Stefan. We need to put pressure on politicians because time is running out. We don't have the same time we had 10, 15 years ago to do it from the bottom up. We need to put pressure on politicians. At the same time, while we put pressure on politicians, working from the bottom up is useful, but insufficient. And that means that we need to accelerate change at the local level by showing that a different economy is possible. In this book, what I did was also to survey so many different examples of local economies that had already become well-being economies, because I needed to convince the reader that this wasn't a dream, it was a reality. And when the reality can be touched, can be seen, can be experienced, it becomes a powerful political blueprint. So the most important power, the most striking power that local activists have is the one of building the world we'd like to see reflected in everyday's life. That's the thing, and showing that what you think is impossible, what politicians are ridiculing, what politicians are considering less developed, less ambitious, maybe more backward, is in fact extremely effective, extremely useful, extremely desirable. Here's maybe the question. We need to understand that going beyond the current growth paradigm is not going back, it's going forward. And that this transition is not only necessary and indispensable, but also desirable. Because when people realize that it's desirable, they become much more ambitious and much more willing to explore new ways of doing things, because they realize that there is a better future ahead of them. And it's not giving up something, it's acquiring something more than what they presently have. Thanks.
Thank you, Lorenzo, and all the people that have put up questions to participate. And Lorenzo, thank you. I will definitely look for your book, and I needed to read it and understand it in depth and regarding all that you have shared to us. I'm going to give the time quickly to Ati.
I'm so sorry to Damaris that I cannot listen to your presentation. I'm going to make sure that I see your recording. So I'm going to make sure that Stefan sends me the final posting of this talk so that I can listen to it. I'm so sorry.
Perfect.
And thank you so much to everyone for inviting me. It's been a great pleasure. And I hope to see you soon in person when we go back to campus again.
Thank you, Lorenzo. Thank you so much. Wish you well in your next meeting as well. See you around. Ati, back to you. We can't hear Ati for a moment. I think
he is on mute, I think.
He's on mute, yeah.
He's on mute, yeah.
Ati, at the bottom of your screen, there's
yes, I've got it. Yeah, sorry, I thought, yeah. No, hello everybody. It's very good to share with you in this very interesting discussion. And to proceed now to the second part of our meeting, where the speaker is Dr. Damaris Parsital. She's a sociologist of religion, working as the director of the Center for Women, Gender and Development Studies, also teaching in the Department of Philosophy, History and Religion at the Egerton University in Kenya. She held research fellowships at the University of Edinburgh and Cambridge University, both in the UK, at the Georgetown University in Washington, D.C., at the University of South Africa, and most recently, a visiting professor of women's studies and African religions at the Harvard Divinity School, dealing with this research topic, the kingdom of holy women, Pentecostalism, sex and women's bodies in an African church. She's a leader for girls' education in Kenya and a mentor to many emerging scholars of religion on the African continent. Yeah, so welcome to Damaris. We look forward to you speaking to us about this topic, Africa's urban future, green, safe, and just. Over to you, Damaris.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Good afternoon, friends and colleagues. Thank you, Stefan, for your kind invitation. I have been invited to reflect on reconceptualizing safe, green, and just cities, challenges for scholarships and theology. Let me begin by saying that throughout this COVID-19 lockdown, I have been in a space of lament, but also one tempered with a melancholy of hope for a better future that Lorenzi talked about. As I have reflected about breath and I can't breathe, that has now become a rallying call for many of us in the social justice movement. I couldn't help to notice how my surrounding and my environment was breathing, and how clear the Lake Nakuru, just a few kilometers away from my house, was clear and clean, and all the animals I could see right from my balcony, looking really just so peaceful. And in the 15 years that I have lived in my neighborhood, for the first time, I was able to see tens of different types of birds singing and happily flying around everyone, something that I had never really seen, at least in the past 1 decade. And as I took a walk every evening, just to enjoy the clean air that was something just so beautiful, and the hummingbirds, the idea of reconceptualizing safe, green, and just cities began to really formulate in my mind. Needless to say that even as I enjoyed this period has also allowed me to reflect about my own privilege vis-a-vis that of my fellow citizens who do not live in green, safe, and secure gated neighborhoods. I became extremely aware about this in a way that really made me stronger in my quest for social justice, gender justice, environmental justice, or ecological justice, and how my privilege should do more to create a more just, safe, and clean world. It is important for us to acknowledge our privilege amidst dehumanizing realities of our people in the context of COVID-19 and how this has further reinforced poverty and inequality and injustice. And I keep thinking about a woman in Kenya who boiled stones to feed her children because she didn't have food at this particular time. And I want to, just for a moment, think about that woman and what that meant for me as a social justice person. Today, I would like to reflect on Africa's informal settlements or slums, where the majority of God's children live, and draw lessons for a safe, green, and just city. Using Kenya's urban informal settlements or slums as a context, I welcome you to reimagine with me what a safe, green, and just city would look like, as well as how that challenges not just our scholarship and research, but also our theologizing and urban ministry for those of us that work in the area of social justice. But before I do that, let me just give a very short synopsis of Africa's leading cities. According to latest data from the UN Habitat and many studies, Africa is urbanizing faster than any other continent, and other studies project that this trend will continue for a very long time. Sub-Saharan Africa alone will see dramatic rates of urbanization in the next couple of decades. For example, Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, Kinshasa, DRC, and Lunda in Angola, for example, are all projected to grow by 5 million inhabitants from 2030, and Lagos by over 10 million people. And I've been to Lagos and I can't imagine that kind of growth. In the midst of this rapid urbanization, it's important to highlight that the majority of Africans live, and many will continue to live in Africa's ever-growing informal settlements or slums, if you like. Africa's growing slums like Nairobi, particularly spaces like Kibra or Dandora, or even the Kailicha slums, or Nima and Gam-Mishe in Accra, are all old and stable and challenge our ideas about informal settlements. There is nothing informal about some of these spaces. Yet Sub-Saharan Africa has one of the highest number of slums, unlike any other region in the world, particularly in the global south. And we need to ask ourselves, why is this the case, as well as how we can rethink about this in theological perspective. Yet Africa's slums are not homogeneous. Instead, they are complex, diverse neighborhoods with contested histories, contested politics, and realities. And we must grapple with these complexities, as well as the structural realities and contested histories that produce and continue to shape them. The persistent growth of slums casts a shadow on prospect for safe, green, and just cities. But we must continue to rethink about it, discern what the Spirit of God is telling us, even as we rethink about the need for a more just and equitable and livable environment. More importantly, we must think about the humanity of the people that live in the slums, where the dominant issues they grapple with include violence. And here I'm talking about both structural and state violence and non-structural violence. In Kenya, during COVID, so many people in the slums have been forcefully evicted, even as their little shanties are flattened to make room for development. And I think I really like the trail of thought in what Lorenzi has just said. And gross human rights violations, poor housing, and spatial inequality, open and burst sewers, and lack of every imaginable services. Yet amidst these dehumanizing conditions, we have also witnessed slums as spaces of incredible creativity, in particular the arts and music and language, like the Sheng language that emerged and evolved out of the slums in Kenya, and the creation of social networks and community and faith and church, and just a world of good amidst just so much dehumanization. More importantly is that all this good, as well as the bad, raises important questions for us as theologians and social justice actors. In particular, I think we must write and continue to document stories of lived experiences of our people and how they make sense of their living conditions, raising families, and living out their humanity in situations that should pierce our conscience, if we still have any. In particular, I think we must think about how do we revisit theologies of human suffering and pain and rethink towards theologies of human flourishing post-COVID. And while I think that slums are spaces of pain and sites of struggle, we as theologians must groan with the spirit about human dignity and rethink equity. So I want to locate these conversations within my reconceptualization of a just, greener, safe city, discern what doing theology in informal slums would look like, especially during the COVID-19 time and post-COVID-19, and how we can rethink social justice amidst obviously complex living conditions for the majority of God's children. Now allow me to dream and reimagine a safe, green, and just city. And I would like now to just speak about a few hallmarks of what I consider a safe and green and just city. Number one is that Africa's cities must be spaces of human dignity and human flourishing, as opposed to spaces and sites of struggle and pain and dehumanization and disease and crippling inequality. I think about human dignity in the context of rights, God-given rights to a life of dignity and respect, a space where human beings are valued not for what they don't have, but for who they are as a people that are also God's children, who have the image and likeness of God, regardless of the living conditions, economic, environmental, ecological, political, or otherwise. I think about dignity as God-given, not state-given, not constitutional given, as God-given. And we need to really just have a moment to think about what that means for our work as social justice actors and as theologians and as people who believe in God. Just thinking about the human dignity of people that have been deprived of every manner of dignity imaginable. Number two is that African cities must also be spaces where there is equity. And I don't know whether I can belabor that better than Lorenzi. An equitable city, as Alfredo Mwenya eloquently describes, must be a city where its benefits must be equally shared among its inhabitants, not spaces of exclusion. To me, it is unconscionable that cities are designed purposely to lock out the other, and create different classes of people, some of whom are more human than others. We must resist that as theologians and as scholars of religion. Here, the poor must also be able to access water and proper sanitation, better and livable housing and environment, as opposed to the toxic, precarious sites that are a threat to health and the security of its inhabitants. We must be able to rethink about a sort of environmental justice and ecological justice as a right also for slum dwellers. Number three is that African cities, especially the informal settlements, must also be safe and healthy. While many cities are generally unsafe, they pale in significance to the kind of violence and insecurity within which slums are located. A hallmark of slums is the sheer lack of safety and security for its dwellers. this is not just about slum violence, but also state sanctioned violence, police violence, and all manner of violence that takes place there. Like we have seen with state evictions of slum dwellers that have just talked about, in the middle of a lockdown, in the middle of a crisis like COVID-19, when people come at night and flatten the slums and leave people who already are extremely vulnerable, leaving them homeless and sick and unable even to be able to protect themselves during such a time. But also thinking about environmental violence, think about the dumping of toxic waste, human waste into the slums of Dandora in Nairobi, or the industrial waste that continues to flow into where humanity lives. But also that the denial of the basic human rights to water and to basic dignity must be seen within the context of violence. I think we must begin to look at lack of a livable environment in itself as structural violence, and as well as politically motivated violence. More importantly is the lack of safety for women and girls and children, including, just around this time, and I think in many parts of the world, including the Western world, just so much was reported about high numbers of gender and sexual-based violence that has trapped so many women in their homes. And violence is no respecter of space, whether you are living in the slums or you are living in the top market. This has been a big deal for many women. Many women just really feel so trapped, and many children have suffered during this particular time. And we must think about the interconnections and the intersections between our vulnerabilities and our poverty with violence. We must also rethink about broader violence, including like the rail and public transport violence, and how that impacts especially women and girls, and how obviously that stands out in their way of their personal safety and dignity, but also and how that impacts on whether they venture out to work or not. And in my interviews with women throughout this particular time, many were unable even to get out to work, even in situations where they had to get out because of just tremendous violence. And that needs to to be rethinked, and how that intersects with so many other issues. And fourth, an important hallmark of African cities, especially African slums, is that they must be green and sustainable. Like many cities in other parts of the world, African cities are trying to become green and sustainable. As I was having a conversation with someone about this, she quickly told me, don't even speak about green, because I do not think we have green cities. But I think it's important that we continue to imagine and to reconceptualize how that looks like. However, challenges persist, and while different areas within Africa's cities are a little more sustainable and greener, like those that, some of us live in the green leafy areas in some towns, those that live in informal settlements, we cannot speak about that. It looks like an impossible long dream to think about how green that can be. And I think this is an important area for us to rethink as theologians about how can we, think about sustainability in the face of just so much challenges. How about green theologies? How do we even begin to think about green theologies when we cannot even think about green cities? And fifthly, Africa's cities must be spaces of African community, the creation of Ubuntu and an agency, spaces to empower people both spiritually and culturally, and should also be areas where people should be able to have that sense of community and create social capital and spiritual capital. There is already a thriving urban ministry in African cities, but what kind of theology and ministry are we having in African slums? And I want us to think about that. Are we just having a prosperity theology, or theology of miracles, or a theology of humans flourishing in the midst of just so much pain and so much suffering? What kind of theology are we thinking about when we think about spaces like this? And what are the challenges for this reconceptualization of safe, green, and just cities for our scholarship? How does these hallmarks of a safe, green, and just city challenge our theologies and our scholarship and our research? I think for me, an overarching quest for us as scholars of theology and religion must be a quest for social justice, a quest for gender justice, a quest for eco-justice or ecological justice, and a quest for a climate change-centered theology. We must be able to think about these issues going forward and post-COVID. How can we reimagine eco-faith that is people-centered as well as environmentally centered? How can we rethink about theologies emerging from gray areas? You know, we like to think about slums as gray areas or from the fringes of the slum. Sometimes as theologians and researchers, we think about doing theology, but we rarely ever think about how our theology and our scholarship can be shaped by gray areas or by margins. What does our theology say about the cities we live in, as well as our silence or inaction in the face of tremendous social, gender, environmental, and ecological justice? How do we discern radically different theologies for a post-COVID world? How can we reimagine radical theologies, green theologies, safe cities, just cities? How do we, and in the words of Emmanuel Katongole, reinvent a new future for slum dwellers? Or in the words of Stefan de Beer, reimagine new theological formations for flourishing African cities in urban Africa 2040. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much, Damaris. It is, it is something that we understand and can relate to what you have said. A very difficult situation that you have to deal with. I think, you mentioned quite a lot of things, violence, also the recovery of the ecology during this time of lockdown, and the need for, imagining different types of society and so on. Maybe I can ask you, at your university, if you think of, say, reimagining different types of communities, the staff members, the researchers or the academics in other departments, like, for example, urban planning, do they have similar dreams? Do you think it's only in theology, or can we get some partners from other disciplines that can work with us?
Thank you. My university has been trying to go green for the last, at least for the last 1 decade, and I think in all fairness, it's a green environment, and we have a whole department of environmental studies that is doing that. I personally started a course on gender and climate change at Egerton University's Institute for Women, and I want to say that this is not a conversation only for theologians. I think this is a conversation for each one of us. Each one of us, as scholars and as individuals and as people who represent communities, must be able to have this conversation and to be able to drive, action or at least a consciousness that people should be able to think about this. But I thought as a theologian and a scholar of religion that this is something that particularly Christian churches can begin to engage, There's just so much action for me taking place in the slums. We have just so much churches in the slums of Kibera. Actually, I was in a research that suggested that there were more churches in Kibera than there were toilets. And I think that has so much implication for our theologizing. And that's why I'm asking the question, what kind of theology are we speaking about in the slums?
Yeah, thanks. And these churches, how would you describe their role? what is the main ministry that they have? Can they play a role also in imagining, say, different communities and different ways of living? Or is it more a matter of survival?
I'm not sure I got that well, but let's take, for example, Kibera. Kibera is this place that is just so dehumanizing in my opinion. At least that's my experience, having visited Kibera a number of times. I found hundreds of churches. There are Pentecostal churches, charismatic churches, there are mainline churches, and there is just a whole world of action, from faith-based organizations that are working in areas of social justice, working with women, working with children, working with education, working with health and sanitation. So there's just a lot in there. But the thing that pricks my conscience is to see evangelical churches there preaching about theologies of prosperity and theologies of miracles in a space where people need real tools to be able to survive and to be able to put food on their tables.
Yes, thank you. I've read a bit about Kibera, a few theses and so on, but what I could not really get from what I've read, the little that I've read, in South Africa, if you look at different informal settlements, in some of them there has been formation of a new sense of community in streets and even beyond streets, where people feel they form a community and they support each other, even pray together, and in that way live out their faith. In others, you get a sort of an atomized existence where people don't relate to their neighbors, and they only greet each other, but they look at each other with suspicion, where there has not yet developed a new sense of community. What is your experience in Kenya? Is there something developing from the bottom up? Or not?
Well, I think it's a very complex space. At once you see the creation of community and people coming together and doing things together. At once you see a sort of division based on ethnic groups, particularly during political interesting times, like during electioneering times, where slums really become centers of violence, ethnic violence, and divisions between who is supporting which candidate. So we have seen that, but we have also we've witnessed people come together to really help each other irrespective of their tribes, particularly when we don't have the politics, when we are not close to the electioneering period. So there's just a whole world of action. So and there are communities that are coming together to try even to make their community better, of course with the help of civil society organization and faith-based organization. So there's a lot of just that's going on in there. It's just a lot.
Oh, yeah. Good. Anybody else who would like to ask a question?
Ati, there's a couple of questions in the comment box. I don't know if you can see them there.
Well, sorry, I didn't see they came in. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. Starts there with Joel and then Rainbow and then.
Okay, no, I didn't see them come in. Okay, thanks, Stefan, or Lance. Good, Joel N. I'll read the question. I had an opportunity to visit Kibera in 2016, and I was even now traumatized by what I saw, and my mind is always stuck on the railway line that cuts through the slum, which for me represents wealth, but human beings are still not being humanly treated. They see and hear wealth pass right under their noses, but without participating activity in it. How long are we still going to have seminars, webinars, and conferences about the poor and poverty, while poverty is consuming our poor people? Where are we going? So yeah, I think we can reflect on what do we do with a conference like this. What is the effect of this, and what comes out of it?
Yeah. So I even don't know how to answer that question. And just so you know, Kibera traumatizes me that I am never able to handle it. Like, I mean, every time I have visited Kibera, I need therapy. You know, it's just really so hard. It's just so dehumanizing to anybody. As to why we are doing webinars about this when there's just so much pain, there's just so much we can do, and I think having these conversations is important, in my opinion, to be able to, you know, think of spurring action. You know, let me just share with you experiences of friends of mine who some of people here know. There's a lot of, you know, good work that is being undertaken by young, progressive, feminist women, young women who are believers in social justice, and they are doing webinars about this to discuss about the issues and mobilizing, you know, for action. And they are right there in the slums, giving people food, giving them masks, you know, taking water there, and, you know, just engaged in civic education to be able to educate these people. So it's important for us to do all these things. We can still be academics and you know, be people who are out there in the ground making a real difference there. And these are also spaces for mobilization, for generating conversation that someone else will pick and say, yeah, okay, this point I think is one that I would want to explore further by taking civic action about it. So I'm not sure I can answer that question. It didn't even look like a question to me. It looked like a reflection.
Yeah, I think the liberation theology approach of see, think, do, if our conference or our webinars fit into that, between the interaction between seeing and doing, it should help us. Another question from Rainbow: how can the churches use the opportunity of COVID to promote God-given dignity when everyone is being in lockdown or talking about social distancing?
Well, there are so many ways in which people are, you know, many ways in which churches are actually on the ground even during this lockdown. Let me say that our country just reopened, I think a week and a half ago. And one of the tensions that churches are having is that, you know, they are not even able to hold services because of the strict regulations that the governments have put in place. That has not stopped people from engaging in humanitarian work. But let's just say this. We have just been on lockdown for the last 4 to 5 months, but churches have been in existence for time immemorial. So we cannot use the excuse and say, oh, we are in lockdown, we cannot do any act, we are not able to, you know, to visit these people. We are even scared for our own lives, so we are hiding. There are many ways in which people are reaching. I have seen people, you know, trying to take care of themselves, covering up and going there, you know, to help humanity. So there's just so much we can do. People, you know, people are sending help there. People are shopping, people are giving money, and there are people on the ground that are receiving that and being able to, you know, to help the people that are in need.
Thank you. We go to the next question from Bulani Enang. So it seems that people are looking for some sort of hope in terms of spirituality, hope and wealth, whilst we look at, once again, to government only to sort out infrastructure and poverty alleviation. African governments have not responded well to social injustice. So it's, yeah, where is our help coming from government, or in terms of spirituality, yeah, wealth? Yeah, that is the question.
What is the question?
I think it's the contrast between, are we looking for help, what is mentioned here in terms of spirituality, hope and wealth on the one hand, and the government also, well, the government has let us down. African governments have not responded well to social injustice. But we still look at government to solve the problems.
Well, I personally have given up on my government to do anything, just as much as many South Africans feel the same about their government. And I am a strong believer in communities finding solutions for themselves with the help of people, social justice activists and actors and civil societies. I think in Kibera, non-state actors do so much more than the government. I think sometimes I'm tempted to think that government goes to informal settlements only during electioneering period. And so there's just that sort of frustration and hopelessness on the part of many of us that government is doing nothing, you know, to help its citizens. One of the questions the conversations that are taking place in the Kenyan, you know, socio and political scene is that we seem to have received so much money for COVID and so much equipment for COVID. Some of them have disappeared mysteriously. But we don't seem to see what is going on. When people get sick, they're still being charged heavily to get treated in government facilities. So I'm not a believer in government. I'm a believer in, you know, grassroots movements. I'm a believer in mobilizing, you know, communities and people and churches and faith-based organizations to, you know, to spur action on the ground. So, and I don't like to speak about government. I'm sorry to say that. I'm not even an authority in government, but some of us just really give up when we see what's going on.
Yeah, I think many of us can relate to that too.
Yeah.
Yeah, another question then says applied theology must, that is from Glennett's points. Applied theology must move us to different contexts, such as the informal settlements or the inner city and so on, suburb. And the church comprises of people from different disciplines and backgrounds. So the question is it not a space where there is an automatic potential for encouraging a multidisciplinary approach in different contexts, but with a church with people from different disciplines and backgrounds? So that is all the gifts of the laity and the whole church as a body.
That question is not clear to me. I'm sorry.
Yeah, it is about the church itself comprises people from different disciplines and backgrounds. And in different contexts, there are different needs and problems that must be responded to. So a congregation with these different gifts in the congregation as a body, as a number of people, not only the minister, is there not a potential for the church to approach things in a more multidisciplinary way?
I don't know about South Africa very much, but I think there's also a lot of fragmentation when it comes to you know, religious organizations in Kenya, and I haven't seen, except when it's controversial issues like you know, right now one of the biggest conversations that has brought all religious organizations together is the reproductive health bill, and or issues of homosexuality, or issues to do with teenage pregnancy and girls' education. We have seen churches in Kenya organize themselves around, those things that are important to them, and that's the only time we've seen them speak together, at least in my own judgment and in my own observation of the Kenyan religious scene. However, and I say this, there's a lot of work that's going on with faith-based organizations in Kibera individually. I haven't seen them coalesce around, like the Catholic Church coming together with the evangelicals and, the Presbyterians and the Methodists and say, okay, let's go to Kibera and do this. It's isolated, individual kind of action. However, there's an emerging thing that to me is so important. They're just groups of people who feel spurred by their own faith and spirituality to go out to do work. And they come together as people of different faiths to go to Kibera or any other informal settlements in Kenya. And it's not just in Nairobi alone, it's in various cities in the country. And they're able to do that, and they are motivated by their faith. And so for me, if religious organizations were to come together, if churches were to come together, I think there might be better action than the kind of isolated ad hoc where people feel like, oh, as a church we are going to do this, and yet the problems are humongous. There's just so much challenges that requires all people coming together, all people of faith coming together.
Ati, sorry, can I just jump in there? I'm just worried our time is up, and we have committed ourselves to a certain time frame, and I see we're starting to lose people. So I wonder if we could just wrap up the discussion at this point, if it's okay.
Yeah, I think we can do that. There are a few two questions from somebody who had to leave in the meantime, and then there are comments about the government and involvement with the church that we have discussed. So I do not see anything new. Also, very hearty thanks from the dean and the vice dean for the two very good discussions. So I give over to Stefan. Thanks a lot, Damaris, for your interesting. It was good to have this time with you.
Thank you so much, and sorry for being abrupt like that. Damaris, thank you so much, and also to Lorenzo, who had to leave because of internet and bandwidth and all of that. We've committed ourselves to our participants to stay within the 90 minutes. I know that your talk have evoked many other things. There are questions. I don't know, Damaris, can you follow the chat room there on the side? Have you seen the questions?
Yeah.
But I mean, if you can just for yourself, there's important questions from Selina, from Bolanle, comments about the interface between practice and reflection. I don't think anybody should see this as an entertainment space. I think what is nice about the group that is on this call is that it's really a combination of practitioners and academics, but also the kind of academics we invite into this conversation. People like Damaris is an activist, is a practitioner and a scholar, and she brings these worlds together. And I think that is part of our challenge right now in the world we live in, that we can't have these silos. We need to allow for the activists to inform our theories, and for the theorists to also help the practitioners to sometimes stop and reflect, because I think sometimes also those of us who are practitioners and activists are lazy to reflect on our work and to do the theoretical hard work that we must do. Thank you very much, Damaris and Lorenzo. Thank you, Zaro and Ati. If I can just say our last conversation of this series, but our hope is that these conversations just triggered more conversation. We want to go deeper on issues of gender and race and environment and the economy, safe and green spaces, etc. And we'll create other formats for that as we continue. The last conversation, again, will be same time slot, 12 o'clock, 2 weeks from now, 7th of August. The question to be raised then is, doing theology now? What, how, and with whom? And we'll have with us Professor Dani Pilario, Interesting person, Dean of a School of Theology in the Philippines, but right now almost all his time goes into hunger projects because of lockdown in that part of the world. People are literally dying of hunger in the Philippines. And so again, somebody that brings these two worlds of the academy and scholarship and practice together. So please don't miss out on 2 weeks from now, and we'll also have respondents that have listened in. Dion, Selina, and others will help us to consolidate what we've done over the last 3 weeks. Thank you so much, and we also hope that this will grow into a small community of practice and reflection with new friends like Tamaris joining us. Thank you so much. Have a good Friday and a good weekend, and God bless you all.
Thank you.
As you all go.